Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar on trauma-informed leadership. So we're going to discuss three topics today, basically governance, power sharing, equity, and HR. And the structure of this today is going to be, we're going to kind of go through each topic and then have a little break for questions. And there is a little questions box on the screen that you can type in your questions on. You can also include them in the chat. Those are kind of where I might miss a question though. So if it's easier, please put it in the question box. Thank you all for joining us. I'm really excited to have this discussion with leaders in the animal services sector. I saw lots of people in BC, so welcome. Lots of people also, it looks like in the United States. I saw somebody in Costa Rica. Thank you so much for joining us. So I am going to go ahead and introduce our panel members. So I'm just going to invite Amy to the stage. Amy is the executive director of the Vancouver Humane Society, and I'll just let her do her introduction. I'm just going to get her to join. And before I do that, I just wanted to share, we're all going to do a brief land acknowledgement. So I am grateful to be listening, learning, and unlearning on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as Vancouver in BC, Canada. And I also just want to acknowledge that land acknowledgements are kind of the bare minimum for what we're trying to do. So in terms of decolonizing and really acknowledging the history in Canada, there's so much more that we can be doing in terms of, you know, reading the calls to action, seeing what you can do in your work life, in your personal life, whether that's purchasing things from Indigenous owned businesses, you know, doing your banking with a credit union rather than one of the large fossil fuel kind of banks, little choices that you can make that can make a huge impact. So I just want to encourage you to think about that. And with that, I'm going to let Amy introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm the Executive Director of Vancouver Humane Society. I reside and recreate on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, currently known as Vancouver and Squamish, and I'm excited to join you today. I'm joining actually from Joshua Tree, California. And Sarita, I think you're muted.
Oh, thank you. I just was adding Danielle so that she can introduce herself as well. Thanks, Amy.
Okay, am I on here? Can everybody hear me? Great. Hi, everybody. My name's Danielle George. I am on the board of directors for Vancouver Humane Society, and I am currently on so-called Kansas, which is the traditional and stolen lands of the ancestral territory of several bands and nations, including the Kaw Nation, the Osage Nation, and the Shawnee tribes. And just kind of echoing what Sarita was saying earlier, land acknowledgements are not something that we just talk about what's happened behind us, between people long ago whose names we may have forgotten. It's not just a history, it's an acknowledgement of our current actions and our present pain of colonialism and a fight for liberation and restoration that we are all experiencing right now. And it's a reference point of our intention to participate in supporting and celebrating the people who have always lived here. I would love to invite folks on this call to support Indigenous organizations by donating your time, attention, and money. You can do that by supporting grassroots movements. You can do that by committing to returning the land. And there are resources that you can look up for that. And at the very least, you can follow and share content from Indigenous creators, leaders, and storytellers. And you can learn about their causes and amplify their voices. So thanks for having me today.
Thanks, Danielle. I wanted to just highlight a resource at the bottom of this slide. Native-land.ca is a resource that was created kind of in collaboration with various nations and bands to create a map that's interactive that you can search where you live. I know that they're up to date in North America, Central America, South America. And essentially you can search for where you live, find kind of which nations are on those lands, what the languages are, and any treaties that are applicable. So I encourage you to take a look at that resource. It's really interesting. Another one is, at least in Canada, the University of Alberta Indigenous History course is another place to start in terms of understanding the history of Canada. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to close this out and we're going to get started on our conversation. So our first topic is organizational governance best practices in a trauma-informed leadership context. So I'm just going to ask some questions and then we'll take turns answering. And I'm also going to, open up conversation in terms of letting things be a bit more organic. So it's okay if we don't go through all the questions, but again, please feel free to post or ask your questions in the chat box or in the questions box. So our first question is, how does the Vancouver Humane Society board ensure that trauma-informed principles are integrated into the organization's governance structure and decision-making processes?
Who is that one for, Sarita?
That one was for Danielle.
Yeah, so being on the board, I've been on the board for, I believe, roughly 2 years now. And I really like this question because when I think about trauma-informed practices, I think it's easy to think of it on a ground level of the person who is directly interacting with the largest population who has the highest chance of needing trauma-informed care. But I think this question really highlights the need that it needs to be throughout the entire organization. It needs to be on a cellular level. It can't be something that there's like a wall or a membrane and these folks up here don't need to understand the concepts and be embracing the practices. I think that the Humane Society, the Vancouver Humane Society board, has done a lot of things that we can have those practices. I think one of them is there is a lot of collaboration and trustworthiness. There's a lot of folks who are doing their best and they are welcome to talk about any limitations they have, any needs they have. And then the same with that collaborative spirit that I think is a part of it. When we do have discussions and we talk about sensitive topics, I think that really shows because people can air their perspectives, they can air their needs and have space to talk about why they feel that way. And we do usually give a lot of runway for having those discussions, which I think is important. I do think that we have some challenges that we need to continue to work on. I think one, there's always the limitations of capacity and creating an environment where we know that that practice is being put into place on a regular basis, and then tending to the culture so that it organically is continuing to grow. So we're not just having a box checking mentality, but I think for the most part, it has been, our biggest accomplishment has been in leaning into and supporting Amy, who is kind of has one foot in the governance arena and then one foot on the ground floor arena because she's helping put those practices into motion on a day-to-day basis. Investing in Amy and making sure that Amy has the tools that she needs and also completely supporting and emphasizing the importance of this program, I think is our greatest achievement. And we certainly have a lot of blind spots we need to address and continue to work on.
Thanks, Danielle. I just wanted to make sure to clarify what program Danielle is talking about. So I realized I completely forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Sarita, my pronouns are she, her. And for accessibility, I am South Asian, I have long dark hair, and I'm wearing a dark green sweater. So the program that Danielle is talking about is the Vancouver Humane Society's Trauma-Informed Training Program, which is a program that is for animal service organizations around the world. And we have 3 courses, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but it's essentially about implementing trauma-informed practice in your organization, talking about compassion fatigue and burnout, and then also how to kind of implement trauma-informed care in a leadership perspective, like we're talking about today. So thanks for your answer, Danielle. The next question is for Amy, and the question is, what steps has Vancouver Humane Society taken to ensure that trauma-informed care is integrated into the organization's mission, values, and long-term strategic planning?
Yeah, I think the first step that we took was to create a justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion policy that kind of gives direction to the operating practices of the organization, and then putting it into our operational plan that we need to not only review that policy but kind of check in and have everyone on our organization complete evaluations and communicate about that policy, what's working, what's not. And then from there, when we were developing our new strategic plan, which just got developed this year, we put in place a kind of mechanism to reevaluate our mission, our vision, and to establish values, because we don't have written values right now as an organization. And so we recognize that that's essentially a gap, and made it an intention. So that's something that we have to deliver on, um, and the board will hold the organization accountable to that.
Thanks. The next question is also for you, Amy. It's, can you describe any policies or procedures that VHS has in place to promote a trauma-informed approach at the board level? I know you just mentioned the one of them. Are there any other you can think of?
Yeah. Well, I can go into more detail about that policy, because I think that can mean a lot of different things for different organizations. So in ours, we go into both kind of theoretical kind of understanding of how we should operate, but then also some more practical items. So, for example, looking at employment, making sure that we're looking at employment from a lens of equity, and making sure that we have practices that are more than kind of just your standard HR practice, but practices that are kind of taking into account the individuals within the organization and their needs. And then also looking at kind of white supremacy culture and calling that out, and referencing documents that you know are huge, and those are things that we can share in a follow-up email, but they give a lot of insight into some of the really common traps that organizations fall into around perfectionism, around top-down leadership, around basically anything that reinforces kind of like a kind of colonial system. And the policy, obviously it takes time to create a significant cultural shift like that, but by reviewing those practices, we're looking at how we can better have, for example, staff, board, me, all on the same page, all at the same level, making decisions together, rather than seeing it as something where any of us has more power than another. That's something that I find really beautiful working at VHS, and I value. So that's one example of many.
Thanks, Amy. I think that's a really, really good example, especially because you're talking about kind of collaboration within the board, but then also kind of across into staff and kind of getting into the like operations of things. And I know that we recently were talking about our kind of diversity, equity, inclusion policy kind of as a group. And I found that process interesting and challenging. And I was really happy that we all were able to kind of openly discuss the things that were challenging and then talk about how we might adapt and change things in the future. I think that's such a good example of how we recognize that we're not going to be perfect, like you're talking about, and this expectation that we're going to be perfect and not make mistakes is coming from this like place of sort of like I guess white supremacy on its own, but like control and all of that. But recognizing like we're going to make a mistake and things aren't going to be perfect, and we can discuss and talk about how we want to change things. So thanks for sharing that. The next question is for Danielle. are there any challenges or obstacles your organization has faced in implementing trauma-informed care practices, and how have you addressed them?
Yeah, I think there are always going to be challenges. And I think, kind of piggybacking off what Amy and you both were talking about, when you are inherently building a system that is going to have even unconscious background threads woven from white supremacy, from a colonial perspective, you're going to have challenges. It's inherent. And I think breaking free of that perfectionist model, and I think also breaking free of a policing model. I think a lot of times when organizations or individuals start to try to create a more equitable system, it can get into a very box checky mentality where you're trying to create the right script instead of freeing yourself from that perfection focus and worrying about saying, oh, am I going to do this not the perfect way? So I think that's one challenge that I see day in and day out, not just with this organization, but like I said, other organizations and people. It can be very hard to not have that gotcha policing model. Like, you didn't do this the exact perfect way. That means you're not a good person. That means you're not a good organization. Which, when you create a model based in that mindset, it's not helping anyone. It's not encouraging growth. It's not encouraging experimentation. It certainly isn't creating a space where someone can try something new, which is inherently going to cause missteps. I think for VHS specifically, I think one of the challenges that I know a lot of folks in the room will probably relate to is capacity. There's always so many pots on the stove, and you have such ambitions to want to do such big work in 100 different areas. And when we are ever talking about intersectional concepts, liberation, dignity for any population, they're going to spill into each other. So then as soon as you start to think, okay, even if we try to narrow it down to this one cause, if we look at this with an intersectional lens, how do we make our work focus on just this and have it be impactful and meaningful? And then when you broaden that to then saying, how do we do this work in a trauma-informed lens? How do we do this work without creating harm to people beyond the scope of this tiny little area we're looking at? That's a lot of capacity. And it's so challenging to even do the work of saying, how do I make my work matter? How do I help this specific population or this specific area of life that I want to make a difference in? And how do I do it well? How do I do it with an equitable lens? It takes time and effort and work to keep that culture alive, and to keep it growing, and not, again, have it be a box checking thing where we can say, oh, we all said the words, or we all took this one class a year ago, so now we don't have to worry about that ever again. How do you make time and space when you are dealing with burnout, when you're dealing with intensive issues, when you are dealing with the constant struggle of balancing self-care with deeply passionate work and building community, and then also do the work of creating and continuing growing that culture? That is a challenge that I've seen at VHS. I don't think it's unique to VHS. And I am always open to hearing how people are creating solutions for it, because life is messy. Organizations full of living people are going to be messy. And all of us trying to do the best work we can in a really imperfect system is going to be messy. So I think capacity is the boiling down point of what I think has been our biggest struggle.
Yeah, I think you're probably right too, that that's not unique to Vancouver Humane or even like animal services. That's probably like a common thing in general in any kind of organization that's trying to make change, any kind of nonprofit. But definitely, probably at least highly maybe expected in the animal services sector in terms of even thinking about like self-care and burnout. So how do we do this work while making sure to take care of ourselves? I know that's really common. So the next question is for me. It's, can you share any recent success stories or examples where your organization effectively applied trauma-informed principles in your programs and services? So I'm going to speak about two programs. One is called the McVitie program, and then one is the program that I'm program manager for, the trauma-informed training program. So the training program I kind of mentioned before, it's kind of, I guess, the content itself is teaching about trauma-informed care, and then my job is to take it to different organizations, like those of you who've joined, who may have even participated, to share about what we recommend based on the study and the report that we did. And I would say that then my job as facilitator, or even, creators of the courses, is to make sure that that program is then trauma informed and sensitive to the experience of the people who are going to be taking the program. So these are kind of two different examples in two different spaces. So that program is sort of geared towards people like yourselves, people like on boards, people who are working in animal services sectors, and I'm coming in it from my background, which is in education and in tech and is not in animal services at all. And I have, a wealth of knowledge about this topic, but I'm coming in and basically being like, hey, we need to show more compassion to the people coming to us. We need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves. We need to change the approach. And so my job, I feel, is going in and sharing this information, but not in that, like, you must do it this way and I know better and that sort of idea. Similar to what we kind of share in the program, which is we don't want to kind of tell people what we know is best, kind of, and we want to work together. So for that program right now, the focus is to figure out how to collaborate with organizations and hear what they're struggling with in order to help them with implementing these things. Once we can understand the benefit of it, it's not my job to be like, okay, now you must fix everything that's wrong with your organization. It's more, how do we make this make sense for you? So that is kind of a key thing with trauma-informed care, is sort of that it's about empowerment, it's about open communication and honesty and trust. So in trying to implement these practices and share them with all of you, I need to kind of make sure that that's done in a trauma-informed way. And based on a lot of the feedback I've gotten, it seems like we're doing that well, so I'm happy about that. The other example is the McVitie program. The Vancouver Humane Society has a program that is basically to offer emergency vet care to those who are under-resourced or unhoused. So someone who has, something happen to their animal, they need emergency surgery of some kind. Generally, it needs to be like a life-threatening sort of injury or kind of problem. And the process to apply for that is basically you could give us a call or go online and fill out the form. And that process is something that Brooklyn, the program manager, has really worked on making trauma informed, and that we don't ask people to kind of explain more and more of what they're going through in terms of their trauma. And there's sort of two sides of this. So for the people working on the program on like the VHS side, we have to think about how to make it trauma informed for them, because they're also going to be hearing all sorts of, traumatic experiences, what's going on for the animals, what the animals are going through, but also the humans, and being on the phone with someone who's going through an emergency kind of deal. So that's a lot of emotional work. So we've done some work on the application to try and reduce how much folks are sharing that doesn't need to be shared. So something we talk about in the program is low impact debriefing, as an example. It's that we kind of go out from outside into kind of the core of the issue. So what do you share with someone when you don't know them very well? And then how do you kind of continue to get into the issue? So we sort of design the application to make sure that we're kind of taking care of those who are reading the applications and talking to people, but also making sure that there's space for people to share what they need to share. We're also, making sure it's inclusive in terms of queer identity. So we do make space to ask people to just share what their name is. It doesn't need to be their legal name. It can be whatever name they want to come up with. It could be a totally fake name. There's space to share their pronouns. There's also, it is necessary because of the way that it works in terms of needing to help people with emergency situations. And if they're unhoused or low income, we need to hear a little bit about what their income situation is. So folks would usually be asked, like, what is your monthly income? And then we go through, we need to kind of answer that question. And often we'll call and have a conversation with them to hear a bit more. And that is something that I think is a challenge, because it's tough to ask someone who is already living on a low income what their financial situation is. So part of that is we need to ask those questions, just like many people who work in, shelters and rescues need to ask tough questions about what's gone on. And it's never about, kind of removing that issue, but just trying to make it a little bit more sensitive. So it'll be things like, we just need it for this exact reason. It says in the application why we need that information. And then also, calling to ask a little bit more, to find a little bit more, and also kind of ensure that we can hear their whole story as opposed to just looking at the numbers. The other thing is I know that those who've taken, who work on the McVitie program do take the trauma-informed training program itself. They go through the courses, but just like Danielle was talking about, this isn't a like, you did it a year ago and now you're done kind of thing. I know kind of because I work at VHS that it's a conversation that's happening all the time. Like, how do we make this better? Or 3 months have gone by and this is a pattern I'm noticing. What do we do about it? And so we have a conversation. So that's a huge part of it too. So kind of externally and internally, how I can see some examples of how we've applied trauma-informed principles. So that's the last question for this section on governance in the leadership context. So I just want to pause for questions. So I'm going to check the chat, and if people have questions, please drop them there. And I'll also just check the questions box itself. It's okay if there aren't questions because we'll ask more, we'll make more space for that, but I'm just going to see if there are any yet. Okay, I don't see any questions yet, so that's all right. Maybe I'll just give it a minute and see. Chat. I see someone typing, so I'm just going to see if that's a question. Oh, thank you, Sarah, for sharing the link to the McVitie program. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead into the next section then. Please, if you have questions, though, drop them and we'll see them as we move along. Oh, okay. I do have a question from Sherry. It says, are you able to share your mission and values? Would either of you, Amy or Danielle, like to answer that question?
Yeah, we can drop a link in the chat to our mission page, and then values. I was mentioning we don't have values written out, so that's one of our goals for this strategic plan is to establish those.
Okay, thank you. We're just going to check again if we have another one. Thanks for dropping that. All right. Let's move into the next section. So the next topic is power sharing and equity. So before we do that, I just want to share a couple definitions so that we're all on the same page. So for power sharing, the definition we're going to work with today is the intentional and inclusive distribution of authority, influence, and decision-making within an organization or community. So it involves creating mechanisms and practices that allow various stakeholders, including marginalized and underrepresented groups, to have a voice and participate in shaping policies and making decisions and influencing the direction of the organization. So power sharing is essentially trying to reduce imbalances in authority and promote more collaboration and transparency and fairness in governance and leadership. And then equity in the context of organizational practice and social systems means ensuring fairness and justice by addressing historical and structural disparities. So we're looking at now, but we're also looking at what's gone on in the past. So it goes beyond general equality, which means that everyone's treated the same, and focuses on giving every individual what they need to thrive. So people may not have access to opportunities that everybody else has. So how do we kind of then bridge that gap? That's what we're talking about when it comes to equity. So it's basically acknowledging that different individuals and different groups or communities might start in different positions. And we want to aim to provide everyone the resources and support and opportunities that they need in order to kind of level the playing field. So it's kind of more about creating a just and inclusive environment where everyone has equal access to benefits and resources and decision-making, regardless of their background or identity. So the first question is for Danielle. How does your organization approach decision-making to ensure that it is inclusive, equitable, and reflective of diverse experiences and needs?
I think similar to the first question where we were talking about, how do we apply a trauma-informed lens in our government decision-making process? I think that there's, and this is probably true of all organizations, I think there are things that are working really well for us that I'm really proud of that we have done, and there are things that we can do better. I think first of all, just in our recruitment of who is on the board, who is creating governance, who is lending their voice to help sculpt and mold the decisions that we make that trickle down throughout the rest of VHS. I think Amy and our leadership of the board has done a great job in opening that door up and making sure that we can hear as many voices and applications as we can for I'm not crazy about the phrase diverse candidates, but I think we have a lot of different voices. And I certainly have loved being not the only queer person in the room, not the only person of color in the room. I think that a lot of times and a lot of models where you are coming from a primarily white, heteronormative, middle class lens, I think that if someone who is in those spaces is like, okay, I check all of these boxes of I'm white, middle class, heteronormative, straight, and you look and you see one person maybe out of 10 who doesn't fit that, you're like, oh, that's very nice for me, or maybe even 2, and you're like, oh, this is such a diverse space. Well, for that person who's there, if you have a person of color, or if you have someone with a visible disability, or you have someone who's queer or is in any other marginalized identity, they see no one else who looks like them, no one else who they can relate to. And then they have to become the voice for representing that entire population. So while the person who may fit the most majority space is like, wow, we have 2 people who are not like me, this feels very diverse. If you are looking around the room and you can think, wow, I bet anyone who doesn't look like me feels like it's all up to them. I think that that's great room for growth, for adding different voices, because we know that just having one voice to represent an entire population isn't really getting that voice. So I think Amy and the executive board have done a really good job of having a pretty good diverse group of voices. We can always do better. I think that we can always continue to make sure that we are doing the work to make sure that someone who may have a disability, who may not be looking in the spaces we are advertising for our next board, would have access to that. We could also make a point of saying in our recruiting what accessibility tools we have on hand and taking feedback on what accessibility tools would make this more appealing for someone who may need those if they were wanting to get involved. It can be a lot of labor for someone who would need accessibility tools to find that opportunity and then say, I'm interested, but I'm wondering what you could do to make this space more accessible for me. I think it goes a long way when you show that you've already thought of making that space welcoming for them. So I think that's something that we have both done well in, and that I'm excited for us to continue doing better. I think the other thing is, again, when I think of principles that I think lend to equity and trauma-informed decision-making, safety and choice and collaboration. I think that there's a lot of room for a lot of dissenting voices. We certainly do have dissenting voices. And there is space to talk about why we don't agree. And I think that that's going to happen when you have a diverse collection of voices. I think, again, when you have a white supremacy perfection focused model, in your mind, it can look like you're doing a great job in cohesion if there's no disagreement and there is no conflict, because on the outside, no symptoms are showing. But what you've actually done is, like, you could have the world's worst head cold and you've taken something that's like suppressing the symptoms. That doesn't mean you don't still have a cold. That doesn't mean that you don't have to address whatever's going on. So I like to see a healthy amount of disagreement and conflict, because it tells me that people do feel safe enough to disagree. People do feel safe enough to have intense conversations, and they don't feel like this isn't a space where they might not be able to share those perspectives. So I think, to summarize, I think we've done a great job of getting diverse voices in there. I would like to see more of that, and I want to focus on how we can make those spaces accessible. But I love not seeing a group of people that I would have a hard time seeing what differences people are bringing to the space. And I think that we could certainly continue to doing the work of keeping up the great work of having safe spaces for disagreement and healthy amounts of conflict.
Thanks, Danielle. I think that's a really good point, that it can look outwardly like everything's going well if there's no conflict, but it might mean that people aren't feeling comfortable to share what they really think, and that a sign of sort of like a healthy environment is that people feel safe enough to bring things up, which is something that I kind of reflect on given what I talked about earlier, where we had some interesting conversations about our diversity, equity, inclusion policy, and that's because people felt safe enough to speak up about what was on their mind, not at the board level, but I hear that that's the case at the board level as well. So the next question is for Amy. What measures has your organization taken to address power imbalances and promote equity within its leadership and governance structures, as well as between staff, volunteers, and clients?
Yeah, so one of the things we did is we put together essentially an engagement and retention strategy for volunteers, staff, and the board. So having all of that contained in one document, thinking of it as like a cohesive unit that that keeps the organization running. We're all part of it together, and investing in it all kind of simultaneously. And so a big part of that is everyone gets a survey, asking about how they're doing, how are they engaging with the organization, what is a strength, what is not going well, what needs to change, and then those are shared. The feedback from those are shared with staff, with the board. We have a lot of transparency. Everything that from even I do a survey. It's anonymous, of essentially feedback from staff about how I'm doing. That gets shared with staff and the board, written responses and everything. And so everyone is aware of what is going well in the organization and what is seen as something that needs improvement. And everyone then collectively is responsible for addressing that. I find it, it's certainly hard, right? When you get feedback that's less than ideal. And when you're like, oh, I need to change this. Like this is really impacting someone. But it's nice because you can also, there's space within the organization to do that. Because it's not like, oh, you're bad because this isn't working. It's not focused on a quality of a person. It's focused on like the collective goal of the organization being stronger, being better. And everyone is investing in that project together. And how that also works practically is when we have board meetings, most discussions are almost all discussions are fully out in the open, unless it's like there's something confidential that cannot be essentially like known to staff because of maybe an individual being mentioned or something like that. But other than that, all conversations are available. Staff can come to the board meetings whenever they want. They can pipe up, talk whenever they want. There's no kind of like division there where it's like, oh yeah, because you're staff you can't come, or because you're staff you can't speak, or something like that. So I find that beautiful. Like I really love that. And I love sometimes it's my job to advocate for our team, but sometimes our team advocates for themselves, and the boards are really receptive to that, and that ends up, I think, making the organization stronger.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, that's something that I've noticed myself, in the organization, is how much transparency there is, and kind of across, like, I was going to say across the board, but like also not the board. Just in general, there's so much kind of openness, and I really enjoy it. It's not something that has kind of been my own experience in working at different organizations. I haven't worked in nonprofit before this one, but this has been a really positive experience for me as well, in terms of feeling comfortable enough to speak. And I think that not to speak for everyone of my identity, but like as a queer woman of color also, I feel like I naturally quiet myself because I don't always feel safe, and that's like my default. And this is probably the first environment I've been in where I've felt comfortable speaking up, or at least going to someone and sharing my thoughts and then hearing how to maybe approach it with the group. And that's like super new for me, and I think highlights that the board and you have done a really good job of thinking about all of this and then actually actioning it and turning this into like a culture and space that feels safe for people. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm gonna pause here for questions about this topic before we go into the last one. Just mindful of time. I'm gonna check the chat. No new questions yet. I have a feeling we'll get questions at the end. So I'm gonna go ahead with our last couple of questions. So the next topic is HR practices and consideration of voices of clients and staff. And so the first question is again for Amy. What is your approach to HR from a trauma-informed lens?
Yeah, this is a big one. I think often in organizations, human resources is designed to protect the organization. That's the mindset that people are trained in, and that can end up being kind of like paternalistic, where people's go to HR thinking that that's a place for them, and then they end up being sort of shocked when they realize that there's protectionism happening, that HR is trying to protect the organization over caring for the individual. That's something that I've tried to really actively work to avoid, and to see HR as, okay, what is the challenge you as an individual are facing? How can we address this? How can we address this? Being creative, looking for solutions, never just like turning something down because it's tradition or like the policy. If something's the policy, why is it the policy? Let's look into that. Let's talk about that. Policies can change. It's not really too big of a deal if it makes a remarkable difference in people's lives. And so one of the practical examples of that is when I started, there was sick days, and the policy around sick days was very like specific and difficult to take, and staff had accumulated a lot of sick days. They weren't taking them, but they were also burning out. And I was like, why is that happening? It's something about the culture and about how this policy is written. And so we've revamped it, a few times. And now we've gotten it to where people can take sick 30 minutes, but it's not called sick, it's called wellness time. And you can take any increment of it. You can take it whenever. You can plan it in advance, or you can take it right away. It's time to get better. It's time to heal from burnout. And so that's one example of like HR is there to make things better for all of us, rather than to because in a way, like, it is still protecting the organization, but it's because we are the organization, and seeing that way.
Yeah, I really like that, what you just said about how it's protecting the organization, but we are the organization, because I think that highlights that, like, that the staff are those who are kind of doing the action of like putting forth the work to achieve the mission. And so if we are not taking care of the staff in any kind of organization, then we're not taking care of the organization. So I really like the way that you phrase that. Okay, we have one last question, and it's not assigned to either of you, so I think kind of it's up to you two how you want to answer this. How does your organization prioritize staff well-being and mental health, especially given the potential impact of secondary trauma from working with those who have experienced trauma?
I can give a start on this, and then Danielle, if you have more thoughts. I think one of the big things that we do is that we have we can always ask for support from our teammates, and say like, hey, I'm having a hard time, and either like, hey, can someone hop on a call with me to help make a decision? So like because decision making can be exhausting, especially when you feel like you're isolated in it. And so sometimes you just need someone else to make the decision for you, and it's like they're not in it, they're not stuck in the emotion, they haven't been yelled at or cried at or whatever it may be, and they can see like kind of logically and empathetically. And so that's a big part, I think, is just supporting each other and having a culture where we talk about our emotions at every meeting, or we try to. We like start each meeting with saying how we're doing. Hey, here's a check-in. I'm burnt out. Or here's a check-in. I didn't sleep last night. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling depressed. I'm feeling excited. I'm caffeinated. Whatever it is. There's a whole range, and everyone's accepted for wherever they're at that day. If we need to cancel a meeting because somebody's not slept, like, we cancel the meeting and they take a nap and they take that time. Like, it's really important to make sure that you feel like you can work with your full self, and you need the space to do that. So I think those are some of the ways. And then the other way is just you know taking time to take a walk, or take alone time basically during a day, and making sure there's space and allowance to do that. So there's very little that we do that's like mandatory. That's we have one team meeting a week, and sometimes people miss it, and that's okay. And we have one-on-one meetings, and sometimes people don't want to do them, and that's okay. And so just making that kind of like we define how we operate, so that we have the best outcome for the people that we serve. I think that's been the kind of like the joy I find in our organizational culture through wellness.
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what Amy said. And the fact of one, I think a crucial ingredient that you've both already mentioned is transparency. I think by having transparency, it lays a very fertile ground for people to see if this is in fact a safe space to be an authentic self. So I think a lot of times if you put the process before the reasoning why or the culture, you'll get something that, again, looks healthy on the outside, but it is people performing the act of whatever it is that you're trying to do, because they haven't been given the space or indications of what will happen if they perform in any other way. So if you are having a situation where you say, hey, let's talk about our emotions, but you haven't created the space or the culture for someone to get any kind of indication of what will happen if they aren't performing joy, if they aren't performing job satisfaction, if they're performing in any other level of saying, I have a need, I have some accessibility, I'm burnt out, I can't do this right now, you're going to get a false positive of people saying, I'm great, which we see all the time when you're at the grocery store and, the person checking out the groceries and you say, how are you? They may not feel like this is the time and space for them to say, I'm doing terribly, I don't want to be here, because they don't have any agency to change or to have access to what they need at that moment. And you aren't going to give that to them either. So if someone is going to ask you, let's talk about our emotions, and I feel like I'm not going to be heard, my needs aren't going to be met, I'm going to do all the emotional labor of being vulnerable and talking about my needs, and then having some go, sounds rough, and kind of floating away. I'm not going to do that emotional labor. And I think Amy and the organization as a whole, I think Amy has done a good job of enacting a space where that can take root. And I think also we've done a great job of having people give feedback on saying, this is what I would need for that space to really make a difference to me, to say how I'm feeling. I think on the other end of that, I think that by having that transparency and having people feeling like I can take that space, I think to some degree language can matter. Amy and I and other folks on the board have had conversations of the difference in, like, again, sick time versus wellness time, or like we were talking about, again, time off. If there is outside of our control a word culture where someone thinks, this is how I can justify taking this resource, this asset, that's a totally different thing, if we can just change how that word is heard or how we internally will use that word, wellness day, sick day. I'm not sick enough to earn a sick day just because I have a slight headache or I have a runny nose. That's not sick enough. But if it's wellness day, saying, I know I'm not going to do my best work. I don't want to be here right now. I'm not in a space where I can or want to be doing XYZ, then we all want you to be well enough to contribute and to feel like you want to be here. And that's a holistic approach that we all need to be contributing to. So even just little details of talking about how can we make it so that this resource that we want to give the team, our volunteers, feels welcoming and not like, I don't know why you didn't use your sick time. I gave it to you, even though I never created an instance that you felt like you could use it. That's on us to make sure that it isn't just something we wave as a carrot, but we never actually make you feel like you can say, yes, thank you, I'll take that. And I think those are big impacts.
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, that's something we actually talk about in the training program, the leadership content, where we talk about kind of modeling using those resources of, whether it's like benefits or the EAP or actually taking a sick day. If you see your leaders doing that, then it helps model it for the people who may not otherwise take it. I know it's something I do when I join a new organization. I'm like kind of paying attention to how everyone's behaving. And if I see other people doing the thing, I'm more likely to do it myself, especially as a new person. But okay, so I know, just want to be mindful of time. We've got 5 minutes. So I do want to share a little bit about our training program and make some space for some final questions. I also wanted to mention that if you stay to the end, you're entered into a draw for a donation to your organization. So keep that in mind for the last 4 minutes. I'm going to quickly share my screen here just to share a little bit about our program. So if you are interested in learning more about the trauma-informed training program, it's totally free online. The courses are totally free, and we do offer facilitated workshops for animal service organizations in Canada. If you're in BC, I might be able to do that in person as well. So if you're interested in that, you can email me at traumainformed@vancouverhumanesociety.bc.ca or go to that link in the chat. I also wanted to share a QR code just to make it easy. These are our 3 courses. So the first one's on burnout and compassion fatigue, which I highly recommend starting with. And then we have our introductory implementing a culturally safe and trauma-informed approach. And the last one is the trauma-informed and culturally safe leadership course, which I would recommend for anyone in a leadership role, whether you're on a board or a manager or any kind of sort of leadership role. So if you scan the QR code with your phone, that should take you to the page where the courses are. And then finally, I wanted to mention our microgrant program, which provides financial assistance to animal services organizations in BC, Canada, that want to participate in the training. So we have some funding for small organizations who might struggle with, in terms of, closing doors for a couple hours or trying to kind of make time itself. So we have some funding to help you with that. And if you're interested, please apply. The deadline for that is the end of January. So that link should also be on the original training program page. But if you scan that QR code, that will also take you to that page where you can apply. If you have any questions about that too, or you don't manage to scan it in time, just feel free to message, and I can also share a link to that in the chat. So with that, are there any final questions? Okay. Thank you, Kay. Just going to get the link to that microgrant as well to share. I'm just going to check the questions also. Okay, no questions right now. We have a couple minutes, so maybe let's hang out and see if any come in, but I do want to be mindful of people's time, so I don't want to stay too long. Thanks for everybody's kind words. Lots of people saying thank you. Okay, this also is recorded, so you should be able to watch it if you need to or share it with those on your team. I don't see any questions, so I think we can maybe end here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reply to the email that you got after the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us and spending an hour with us this morning, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week and that you manage to take some rest and take care of yourselves. And thank you, Amy and Danielle, our panelists.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks for being here.